Thank you, Professor Ko. Ambassador Viets, Professor Tommy Ko, Mr. Richard Magnus, Mr. Zainul Abidin Rasheed, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and most importantly, students. Thank you for having me today. Before I speak about my own experiences and 3 lessons that I would like to share from our work in Cambodia, I would just, if you would permit me, share something a little bit lighthearted on this solemn occasion. And that is the importance of having mentors. And I'm speaking directly to the students here. As a Singaporean, it's not very often that you see people being interested, let alone beginning a career in genocide prevention. I think I speak for the majority of students in this room, and I shall take it that every single student in this room has signed up to be part of this movement. If you feel otherwise, please leave. And I tell you the reason or the way in which my own interest was sparked and that I'm able to stand in front of you today after working at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, which is backed by the United Nations in Cambodia for the past 4 to 5 years, has been because of mentors in this country. All the people you see assembled tonight, or this evening, have experience, whether it's from the legal field as former judges, as Mr. Richard Magnus, or as former parliamentarians like Mr. Zainul Abidin Rasheed. They've done work which has helped to ensure that genocide or racism is kept at bay. But the person, whether he knows it or not, who helped to get me started was actually Professor Tommy Ko, because in 2007, we had an opportunity to have lunch where everyone at that lunch was dead set against me and my wife making a trip to Cambodia to start getting involved in work related to genocide prevention. And Professor Tommy Ko was the first person who said, "Don't worry, you'll be fine. I'll introduce you to the ambassador for Singapore in Cambodia. Get started. Go now." And so here I am. The Holocaust, as has been eloquently expressed by the earlier speakers, leaves a tragic legacy for the entire world. And as Prof. Ko and Ambassador Viets have mentioned, this is not restricted as the sole preserve for Germany or Europe. Indeed, it has spread far beyond. For any of you who have made a trip to Phnom Penh, on your way to Siem Reap, to Angkor Wat, if you've stopped over in Phnom Penh, you will all have seen S21, or called Tul Sleng, which is probably one of the most famous or infamous and notoriously infamous torture sites in Cambodia. What is interesting, though, is that unlike Auschwitz and other detention centers in Western Europe, S21 remains in a gross state of disrepair, in part because Cambodia and the world have waited for 30 years to have some measure of justice for Cambodians and to put in place days like today to remember what happened those 30 years ago and to ensure that it never happens again. We're hoping that the processes that have begun, both for accountability and reconciliation, will begin to bridge this gap and do the work that we need to have done for Cambodia. When we look at the significance of the Holocaust for this region and what should be done, there are 3 lessons that I would like to share. The first, I think, begins with understanding what genocide and mass atrocity really are. We use these words as though they are automatically defined, and as though anyone and everyone, just because we all went to high school, should automatically understand what it does mean and the scope of genocide. My own experience for myself was that I didn't understand genocide when I first started doing work in Cambodia. I always imagined it as conflict, as crimes committed in the context of persecution, ethnic cleansing, and other gross human rights violations. That is technically true. But I think with genocide and mass atrocity, you can't begin with the commission of the crime. And you certainly can't begin just with the aftermath. You've got to start with what led to the commission of the crime. What were the seeds of genocide which were not prevented or deterred, which allowed such an inhumane act to take place. And when you start looking at these seeds, both in Cambodia and beyond, what you notice is that even though the crime of genocide is identity related, differences in identity alone are not the cause of it. Differences can also stem from income inequality. It can stem from differences in the provision of important and necessary services. It can stem from differences in access to power in different communities in the country. And in fact, these very differences, when they prompt genocide, exacerbate and entrench the differences. They don't change the differences. They make those differences last for generations beyond. When we begin from that angle, we realize that we've got to ask the right questions if we want to approach genocide. You don't just ask the question which us lawyers unfortunately begin to ask of, who is responsible? That's a secondary question. It's important, and accountability and justice are always my first priority. But before you even come to justice and accountability, you've got to ask yourself, how did we get there? And in the context that we have seen, there's some other questions that you also need to ask. In Asia, I would say you need to ask, why did some countries end up having ethnic conflict and not others? When to some degree, despite the differences, there are many similarities between the countries in this region. What factors might have influenced the degree and propensity towards conflict? Right. Are some regions different? And what sorts of safeguards exist? And what sort of, as Mr. Richard Magnus mentioned, early detection signs exist that every country should begin to consider? The reason why this is such a stark reminder in Cambodia, which is going through this situation, and Cambodia is not the only one, it's the same case in any other tribunal that we're seeing around the world. The reason I would say this is we should not see tribunals as the be-all and end-all solution to genocide, because they come right at the end of it. We really have to see at what the root causes are, and in connection with this, I'd say that the primary responsibility for genocide prevention begins with the state, the national jurisdiction. The International Criminal Court is but a safety net. You always need to ask yourself, what can the state do? What is it doing? And certainly you've got to begin also with not just asking what it's doing wrong, but what it's doing right, because these are the sorts of lessons we want to replicate.